This is Historic Blah, where the past comes alive in minutes. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and comment your city. I want to see where our history lovers are watching from. Blue Book Story 1. The long, uneventful life of Emperor Franz Joseph's dining schedule. It is the year 1854. Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, a clean-shaven young man with precise posture and unblinking discipline, is 24 years old. He rules over a sprawling empire of languages, landscapes, and ideologies. Yet amid the chaos of revolutions and the reshuffling of European power, there is one thing that remains entirely unchanged for nearly 7 decades: his breakfast. You are standing in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. The ceilings are so high they echo the muffled steps of servants padding across the halls. At precisely 4:00 a.m., the emperor wakes. No alarm is needed. He has woken at this time every day since he turned 18. This is not just a habit, it is a matter of discipline, identity, and perhaps the only real control he has over his vast and complex empire. He begins with a walk indoors followed by cold ablutions. He will not bathe with hot water. It is said that only indulgent men bathe in warmth. Then at 5:30 a.m. his breakfast is served: 2 hard rolls, 1 slice of ham, a single cup of coffee black every day for 68 years. There were exceptions, of course. The occasional state trip, illness, war. But even in military tents during the grim days of the Austro-Prussian War, when Vienna trembled under rumors and telegrams, his valet ensured the same breakfast was prepared. Franz Joseph did not believe in improvisation. His logic was unimpeachable. If one controls the morning, one can control the empire. What is less known is the elaborate mechanism behind these dull breakfasts. The Hofburg Palace kitchen had an internal ledger, a breakfast log updated daily by hand where chefs initialed next to the ham-delivered line: salt content, origin of meat, day of slaughter. The emperor believed that spoiled meat would dull his mental clarity. After a brief food poisoning scare in 1856, it was the ham. A separate kitchen staff member was permanently assigned to ham oversight. His coffee came from Trieste, always Trieste. Even during blockades and economic hardship, when Triestine shipping was under surveillance or threat, Franz Joseph's personal courier system delivered the beans. When war in the Balkans disrupted the flow, he approved military budget reallocations to continue the route, classifying the expense under essential domestic logistics. Coffee, for the emperor, was never luxury, it was fuel for governance. To understand the absurd intricacy of this routine is to understand the nature of Franz Joseph's monarchy. He reigned not with vision but with regularity. While other monarchs concerned themselves with ideology or reform, Franz Joseph's rule was about continuity. He believed his people did not need transformation. They needed consistency. And so he offered the greatest consistency he could muster: himself. By the 1870s, his dining schedule had become folklore within the imperial court. Foreign dignitaries were sometimes brought into the kitchen not to admire the silverware, but to observe the ham process. The Prussian ambassador reportedly called it a ritual of absurd yet admirable fastidiousness. Lunch was no less mechanical. Promptly at 12:00 p.m. lunch was served: veal, potatoes, and a seasonal vegetable boiled, never roasted, sometimes rice. Dessert was a single preserved apricot or prune, depending on the availability in the imperial orchard storage facility. The emperor disliked variety. When asked why he ate the same thing every day, his answer was succinct: variety is distraction. These decisions may appear dull, even comedic, but they reflected an important political philosophy. At a time when empires teetered under the weight of revolutions, modernization, and ideological ferment, Franz Joseph believed in stillness. He would not modernize his wardrobe, his breakfast, or his worldview. But there was also a loneliness in this consistency. His wife, Elizabeth, known to the world as Sissy, was his opposite: vibrant, elusive, free-spirited. She loathed the regimentation of court life. Her meals were often skipped. She refused to dine in the rigid schedule her husband maintained. By the 1880s, she was dining alone, often in foreign countries, while he continued his veal and prune routine with unflinching devotion. What emerges then is not a story of an emperor obsessed with food, but of a man who feared unpredictability more than boredom. Every slice of ham, every sip of black coffee, every exact second the food was delivered, represented a small victory against the chaos of the world. If the empire could not be tamed, at least breakfast could. And yet, despite all this control, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was crumbling. Nationalist movements, economic unrest, assassination plots, none of them were dissuaded by his breakfast schedule. If anything, the emperor's consistency became a symbol of the empire's inability to adapt. And as he aged, and his mustache grew more drooping and yellowed, his diet remained unchanged even as the world around him transformed entirely. In 1914, at the age of 84, he still ate 2 rolls, a slice of ham, and 1 cup of black coffee. That same year, his nephew Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The war to end all wars had begun. But in the Hofburg Palace, as gunpowder lit the continent on fire, the kitchen staff quietly initialed "ham delivered" once more. Franz Joseph believed that the world, if ordered, could be made peaceful. But can peace be maintained by routine alone? By the time Franz Joseph reached his middle years, his schedule had hardened into ritual. To dine with the emperor was not merely a matter of hospitality, it was a tightly choreographed act of state, one that blended the banal with the bureaucratic. Guests who attended these meals often left not with stories of engaging conversation or lavish indulgence, but of silence, potatoes, and relentless punctuality. Lunch was the centerpiece of his day, not because of what was served, but because of how it was served. At precisely 11:45 a.m., a palace functionary would enter the emperor's study. He would bow once. Then, without a word, he would place a card on the desk. The card bore a single word: Mittagessen, lunch. By 11:50, the emperor would rise and walk alone to the dining room. His gait, recorded by observers, never varied. His steps were measured, always the same number from study to dining room. Guests were expected to be standing behind their chairs by 11:55, hands folded, mouths closed. To arrive even 30 seconds late was a diplomatic slight. The dining room itself was modest compared to the Baroque excess of other royal courts. White linen, crystal glasses, a small floral centerpiece dried, never fresh, as fresh flowers carried unpredictable fragrances which the emperor disliked. Each guest had a single knife, fork, and spoon, nothing more. No decanters, no shared platters. Each plate arrived pre-portioned, predetermined, and perfectly timed. Franz Joseph always sat at the head of the table. He rarely made eye contact. Conversation was minimal, and it followed strict hierarchies. Military matters first, then diplomatic updates, then internal court issues. If you were invited as a foreign envoy, you were permitted to speak only when addressed. Most were not. The food was simple and always Austrian. Veal was common, as were boiled beef, cabbage, and potatoes, lots of potatoes. He did not enjoy French cuisine, nor did he approve of rich sauces or spices. There was no pepper on the table. When offered a French-style ragout by an ambitious chef in 1878, he declined with a frown and instructed that plain nourishment be reinstated at once. Behind this rigid simplicity was an elaborate machine of logistics. The palace had an entire department responsible for timing meal preparations. The kitchen was located 2 floors below the emperor's dining room. Because he disliked steam or kitchen smells reaching the upper floors, the food was transported in covered, sealed lifts. If the lift operator was slow, the dish was returned and made again. Cold food was a disgrace. The kitchen logbooks from the 1880s still survive in the Austrian state archives. In them, we find handwritten entries for daily potatoes, including number of potatoes boiled, length of boil time, weight post-drainage, and a small note from the chef. Emperor consumed all. These entries are devoid of personality, yet they reveal a machine-like consistency, carried out over decades with astonishing precision. No wine was served unless a special guest required it. Franz Joseph drank only water still, never sparkling. He did not believe in luxury during meals, considering it vulgar and destabilizing. A meal was not a place to enjoy oneself. It was a functional refueling. He once told an aide, "The stomach is not a theater." Of course, there were occasional deviations: weddings, holidays, imperial anniversaries. On such days, a pastry might be served, perhaps a small apple strudel or plum dumpling. But these were the exception, and they were rationed with deliberation. In 1892, for example, the emperor allowed a dessert of Kaiserschmarrn to be served to a Hungarian delegation. The event was later described in local newspapers as a gesture of rare softness. The contrast between Franz Joseph's private restraint and the public grandeur of the empire was striking. While the monarchy projected opulence through balls, pageantry, and coronation rituals, the emperor himself ate like a schoolmaster. This was not affectation. He believed indulgence weakened the mind. He wrote once in a private note, "One governs through clarity, and clarity comes through self-discipline. If I cannot control my hunger, how can I control the state?" By the late 19th century, this dining discipline was institutionalized throughout the palace staff. New cooks were trained in the Imperial Meal Manual, a book written entirely in ink and stored in a locked drawer. It included notes such as, "Boil carrots to medium softness. Emperor dislikes mushy textures. Apricot compote must not be sweetened beyond natural fruit sugars. Bread roll edges must remain crisp. Do not press." Even the tableware had rules. Plates were replaced every 10 years to avoid the appearance of overfamiliarity. The same basic design was used: no patterns, only the imperial eagle in faint gold at the rim. Flatware was not polished to a shine, as excessive gleam was considered unsettling. For visiting royalty, this could be baffling. Queen Victoria reportedly found Franz Joseph's meals Spartan and devoid of charm. The Tsar of Russia described his lunch as a silent battle of self-restraint. But the emperor did not care. These meals were for sustenance and order, not entertainment. His court, likewise, mirrored his rhythm. Officials took their lunch based on the ringing of the emperor's silver bell. Ministers coordinated schedules to avoid dining while he was in session. Even government offices adopted his timetable, out of deference and alignment. And yet, as the 20th century approached, this entire system began to feel increasingly antique. The world was modernizing rapidly: telegraphs, automobiles, electrical lighting. Monarchies were ceding space to parliaments. Ideas of nationalism, socialism, and democracy stirred the youth. But in the Hofburg Palace, Franz Joseph's lunch remained fixed. In a particularly poignant incident in 1908, while dining on lamb and potatoes, he received a report that Serbia had mobilized troops along the border. He acknowledged the report, folded it in thirds, placed it beside his plate, and continued eating in silence. The machine did not pause, not for war, not for peace. The emperor's daily lunch, then, was a mirror of his politics. It wasn't meant to change. It was meant to persist, regardless of what swirled outside. Like his aging portrait that hung in every government office, his dining habits became symbols of unchanging authority. But symbols can grow brittle. And so the question arises, can an empire survive on structure alone if the world outside that structure is already shifting? By the early 20th century, Franz Joseph had become a living relic. His face appeared on coins, stamps, portraits, and the walls of modest inns throughout the empire. His routines were known in towns that had never seen a telegraph, and his dinner hour 7:00 p.m. precisely remained as fixed as the time zones he had once helped standardize. Dinner, the final formal meal of the emperor's day, followed the same model of stoic regularity as breakfast and lunch. Unlike the lavish suppers enjoyed by other monarchs or the fashionable soirees of aristocratic Vienna, Franz Joseph's evening meals were sparse, quiet, and by design utterly unmemorable. And yet, their very uneventfulness became a kind of monument to endurance. The final meal of the day. The dinner bell rang promptly at 6:55 p.m. No music, no flourishes. The emperor walked unaccompanied from his writing desk to the private dining room, often reviewing memos or diplomatic reports until the very last moment. Guests were exceedingly rare by this point in his life. Most evenings, he dined entirely alone. He would sit at the same place at the same table each evening, an oaken piece crafted in 1849, unadorned save for a simple runner of linen. His meal would arrive under a silver cloche, delivered by a footman who would say nothing unless addressed. Dishes were placed one at a time, in silence. A typical dinner in the final years of his life might consist of a thin beef consommé, a boiled chicken breast with rice or overcooked noodles, stewed apples or quince unspiced, dry toast or a hard roll, water or weak herbal tea. These foods were chosen for their blandness and digestibility. By the early 1910s, the emperor's health was sound, but his appetite modest. He ate slowly, methodically, often without finishing the plate. When asked if he wished for variety, his reply remained the same: "It is not the purpose of food to entertain." The kitchen staff, aging with the emperor, continued their duties with the precision of liturgy. They polished pans that had seen no change in recipes in 40 years. They logged boiling times and salt levels with the same care a scribe might once have reserved for scripture. Meals were no longer simply meals, they were acts of devotion to a man who had become more ritual than ruler. The dining room as stage. By this time, Vienna had changed. The fin de siècle had given way to a modernist current. Outside the Hofburg, cafes buzzed with intellectuals. Klimt's paintings shocked the public. Freud was rethinking the human mind itself. Yet inside the palace, time remained obedient to Franz Joseph's fork. The dining room's electric lighting, a late concession, was installed reluctantly in 1905. The emperor preferred gaslight or candles, but his advisors insisted on modernization. Even then, the bulbs were dim, yellow, designed to mimic the older glow. Servants were required to maintain absolute silence during dinner. The clink of a spoon or the shift of a shoe was considered an offense. It was not uncommon for a servant who sneezed or coughed during the meal to be reassigned for the evening. No conversation occurred unless initiated by the emperor, but in his final decades, he rarely spoke during dinner. He would sit, chew thoughtfully, and stare at the blank wall or a faded painting of Maria Theresa. There were no mirrors. He disliked being reminded of his age. Some have suggested these long, silent dinners reflected a deeper melancholy. His beloved son, Crown Prince Rudolph, had died decades earlier in a tragic murder-suicide pact at Mayerling. His wife, Sissy, had been assassinated by an anarchist in Geneva. His brother Maximilian was executed in Mexico, and his nephew, Franz Ferdinand, next in line to the throne, would meet the same fate in Sarajevo. And yet, Franz Joseph's dining habits did not change. Dinner during war. Even as the First World War consumed Europe, the emperor's dinner remained untouched by the flames of modernity. In 1914, when the guns of August roared, when troops mobilized and nations collapsed, the kitchens at the Hofburg continued their schedules. The boiled chicken arrived on time. The consommé was not oversalted. The quince was stewed, not roasted. When the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed, setting off a chain reaction that would upend world history, Franz Joseph received the news just after dinner. He reportedly nodded solemnly, said nothing, and retired to bed as usual. Later, when asked about the assassination, he was said to have muttered, "A higher power has re-established order." Even in the midst of global catastrophe, his dinner hour did not move. The final years, Ritual and relevance. By 1916, the world Franz Joseph had tried to preserve was gone. The war had dragged on longer than anyone expected. Food shortages gripped the empire. Men were dying in muddy trenches from Poland to the Alps. The multi-ethnic cohesion of the Habsburg realms, held together by tradition, bureaucracy, and symbolism, was rapidly unraveling. And still, each evening, the old emperor dined alone. There's a peculiar dignity in this. To cling so completely to a ritual, even when the world had changed beyond recognition, was a final act of defiance or resignation. Whether he believed his schedule could stabilize the empire or simply saw no other option is unclear. But to the very end, Franz Joseph believed that continuity was virtue. On November 20, 1916, Franz Joseph sat down to his final dinner. Records indicate he ate lightly: consommé, dry toast, and poached pear. He retired to his chambers and never awoke. He had reigned for 68 years. The next evening, the imperial kitchens did not prepare dinner. For the first time since the 1840s, the logbooks remained blank. The ovens were cold. The silverware remained unused. Legacy of a meal. What do we make of such a life so ordinary in its daily rhythms, yet attached to an empire that shaped global history? Franz Joseph's dining schedule may seem trivial, even absurd, and in a sense it was, but in another sense it reveals a fundamental truth about history. Power is not always found in action. Sometimes it is found in habit, in systems, in the boring, unchanging rituals that give the illusion of permanence. Franz Joseph was not a reformer. He was not a thinker. He was not even particularly warm. But he was steady. And for many in his empire, that steadiness was a kind of comfort. After his death, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. Within 2 years, the world he had governed through memos, routines, and 3 daily meals ceased to exist. Borders were redrawn. Monarchies fell. New ideologies took root. The 20th century had begun in earnest. And somewhere in the archives, a note remains written by a palace chef in careful script on brittle paper. 7:00 p.m. dinner served. Emperor ate slowly. No complaints. Perhaps that in the end is all any empire can hope for. A quiet dinner, finished in peace, while the world outside continues to turn. Blue Book Story 2. The bureaucracy of the Ottoman Janissary Pension Fund. It is 1713 in Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire. Outside the imperial arsenal, the streets are alive with clamor, vendors hawking simit, the creaking of ox carts, distant calls to prayer echoing off sandstone walls. But inside a small, shaded chamber of the Esamhain, the atmosphere is hushed. Here, there is no swordplay, no fire, no Ottoman splendor. Only ledgers, rows and rows of them. This is the heart of one of the empire's most meticulous bureaucratic creations. The Janissary pension register a centuries-old log of pay, promotions, allowances, and pensions for the Sultan's elite infantry corps. These soldiers, the Janissaries, once stormed the gates of Vienna, guarded imperial caravans, and policed cities. But when they aged, retired, or became unfit for duty, they entered another world entirely. A world of quills, ink, folded leather, and clerks who knew more about ink density than battlefield tactics. And you, listener, are now in that quiet world. The Ottoman Empire, often associated with vast conquests and imperial spectacle, was also built on the shoulders of mind-numbing detail. The Janissary Corps was no exception. Their strength didn't lie only in discipline, it lay in administration. Each Janissary had a esame, a salary ticket number, and that number governed everything. Their rank, their ration rights, their eligibility for retirement, and most critically, their pension. But receiving that pension was a slow, precise ordeal. First, the soldier had to prove that he had served continuously and without dishonor. This required the presentation of his esame defteri, a personal pay ledger. If it was damaged, lost, or out of order, the claim could be denied. Pension reviews happened twice a year, always in spring and autumn. Claimants lined up outside the bureau, often waiting for hours, sometimes days. There were no appointments. The waiting courtyard had no benches. Most stood quietly. Speaking out of turn or complaining could result in being blacklisted from the process. Order, above all, was sacred. Inside the bureau, teams of clerks sat at cedarwood desks, their fingers stained with ink and their robes perpetually dusty from paper and parchment. Each application was processed by at least 3 separate offices. The Rusnam's office, which verified years of service. The Kalmii, which confirmed behavior and loyalty records. The Muhim Odasi, which approved financial appropriations. Only after all 3 offices signed off could a pension be issued. The payout, modest though it was, came in acts, the silver currency of the realm. But these were never handed directly to the janissary. Instead, the payout was recorded in the pension treasury scroll, countersigned by both a clerk and a military official. Then, and only then, was the sum released, usually in folded leather pouches, tied shut with string and sealed with wax. An observer from Venice once wrote that the process was as dry as the deserts of Anatolia, and yet more fearsome than any sword, for an error in ink could cost a man his dignity. The clerks were not warriors, but they wielded enormous influence. The senior scribe, or katibai evil, was more powerful in retirement halls than any officer. It was he who interpreted policies, enforced deadlines, and adjusted records if necessary. Entire reputations rose and fell based on his tone when calling out a name. There were appeals processes, but these were no faster. An incorrect entry, say, a missed year or an unpaid month, could take up to 3 years to correct. During this time, the pension would be withheld. Many soldiers died before their cases were resolved. And yet this system persisted. Why? Because, as odd as it sounds, it worked. The Ottoman state, more than most European powers of the same era, kept remarkable records. The janissary pension ledgers from the 17th and 18th centuries still exist today, massive tomes of neat Arabic script, knotting even the smallest of sums. They reveal a military class that was intimately connected to the bureaucratic heart of the empire. Even rank-and-file janissaries were trained to maintain personal scrolls, copies of their postings, disciplinary notices, and pay logs. The typical janissary retired with 5 to 6 bound folios documenting his life in service. These weren't just archives. They were the keys to survival in old age. Retirement itself was granted based on a formula that seems comically precise by modern standards. A janissary who had served 21 years and 8 months, for example, might qualify for half pay. A man with 25 years and at least 1 campaign medal could qualify for 3/4 pay. Those injured in battle received monthly grain allotments, stored in the imperial granary and recorded in the Shereminetti scrolls. And what of widows and families? Surprisingly, they too were accounted for, though barely. A widow of a janissary could petition for 2 years of extended rations, but only if she could produce his Esame number and show up to verify identity in person. If the records were incomplete, the pension lapsed. Bureaucracy did not honor memory, it honored documentation. Yet for all its dryness, the pension system preserved an unspoken bond between the soldier and the state. The ledger was not just a payroll tool. It was a symbol of belonging. To lose one's Esame record was not just to lose money. It was to vanish from the empire's institutional memory. And vanish money did. By the early 1800s, the janissaries had grown politically unwieldy. Their pensions, once a source of reward, became a drain on the treasury. Falsified claims grew. Nepotism crept in. Some janissaries, long retired, continued to draw full pay thanks to bribes or ghost entries never struck from the ledgers. The Bureau knew this. So did the Sultan. But what could be done? To tamper with the pension fund was to threaten a centuries-old tradition of loyalty. The paper mountain was becoming unstable, but no one dared pull out the first page. And so the process continued, letter by letter, ink drop by ink drop. Until, finally, in 1826, the entire Janissary Corps was abolished in a bloody purge known as the Auspicious Incident. But what happened to the pensions? What happened to the ledgers, the clerks, the dried ink? That is a quieter story, and one worth unfolding next. It is 1826, and the Great Fire has begun not of buildings, but of men and memory. The Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II, weary of insubordination, palace coups, and the stagnation of his once elite corps, has declared the auspicious incident. The Janissaries, long seen as untouchable and ungovernable, have been branded a threat to the state. Their barracks are shelled, their bunks set ablaze, and their political associations dismantled. In a matter of days, thousands of Janissaries are dead. Thousands more flee, are arrested, or simply vanish. And yet, amid the smoke of revolt and the cries of political renewal, a strange sight unfolds at the edge of the imperial archives. Clerks are still showing up to work. The pension registers, some dating back over 2 centuries, remain in their shelves. Wax seals remain unbroken. The Uneventful, chief scribe of the Janissary Pension Bureau, reports to duty the morning after the purge. He is not a soldier. He has no weapon. His loyalty is not to a corps, but to the documents that define it. And so he sits, opens a bound ledger, and continues copying entries for men who may already be dead. Why? Because no one had told him to stop. Paper after power. The destruction of the Janissaries created a vacuum, not only in military might but in institutional memory. Their pensions, complex, sprawling, and often legally binding, could not simply be erased overnight. Thousands of families, widows, and dependents were still drawing support from the fund. Halting it abruptly would mean economic ruin, not just for individuals, but for whole neighborhoods of Istanbul, Salonika, and Edirne. And so the pension clerks pivoted. What was once the Esamhain became the defunct Corps Payment Office. It sounds absurd, but the Ottomans, ever obsessed with record-keeping, preferred transitional continuity over abrupt abolition. Rather than burn the ledgers, the imperial administration rebranded them. Pensioners were no longer called Emekli Yenissary, retired Janissaries, but Mustafi Devlet Hizmetlisi, retired civil servants. The terminology changed. The forms did not. A retired Janissary from 1801, assuming he had survived the purge and did not resist, could still collect a pension now processed through a different office, with a different seal but identical paperwork. This cautious transition revealed a core truth of Ottoman governance. Even in revolution, paperwork prevailed. The clerks' quiet resistance. Not all within the bureaucracy agreed with the purge. Some senior scribes had spent decades administering the Janissary rolls. They had known the men by name, by number, by signature. When asked to update the registers by crossing out certain names or expunging entire sections, many hesitated. Some refused. Others deliberately misfiled documents to lose records that might incriminate living soldiers. In the Divan Letter 131 Humayun archives, historians have uncovered sheets with faint diagonal lines, a scribe's silent protest, a refusal to fully erase a name. One anonymous clerk in a margin beside a redacted entry scribbled a simple phrase: "He fed 3 children, do not forget." Such annotations did not stop the state's consolidation, but they preserved fragments of humanity within the bureaucracy. Paper, in the Ottoman world, was not just administrative, it was moral memory. The rise of ghost pensions. As the years passed, something curious began to happen. The Janissary Pension Fund, now repurposed, continued to grow. With fewer active claimants and fewer audits, the bureaucracy began to list pensions for ghost claimants, men who no longer existed, or perhaps never had. Some of these entries were the result of clerical inertia. Others were deliberate fraud. In Anatolia, small-town officials quietly claimed Janissary pension payments on behalf of non-existent veterans. In Istanbul, mid-level bureaucrats kept legacy ledgers that allowed their department to draw continued funding, even after the last legitimate claimant had died. By the 1840s, the Ottoman treasury was still disbursing thousands of acts monthly to what were essentially paper shadows. And yet the government didn't shut it down. Why? Because the pension system, however bloated, remained politically useful. It helped stabilize local economies. It preserved a sense of continuity. And above all, it was easier to let the clerks maintain the illusion than to dismantle the ledgers entirely. In a sense, the Janissaries had achieved a posthumous victory. They had been defeated militarily, erased from public ceremonies, and demonized in reformist literature. But in the back rooms of the treasury, they still existed on paper, in ink, line after line, entry after entry. Pension to Civil Fund. By the 1850s, the former Janissary pension program was absorbed into the newly formed Civil Servants Relief Fund, a broader system meant to serve aging scribes, lower-ranking officers, and minor officials. The form templates, incredibly, remained mostly unchanged. One could trace a single box, Yıllık Hizmet Suresi, years of service, from a 1770 Janissary ledger to an 1855 postman's retirement claim. This continuity baffled European observers. A British envoy once wrote, "The Ottomans are a people who reform without discarding, they simply rename." This was not laziness, it was intentional. By retaining the framework of the Janissary pension system, the Ottomans avoided legal upheaval. The state could claim it was modernizing, while quietly honoring its ancient mechanisms. In this way, the spirit of the Janissary ledger outlived the core itself. A bureaucracy without its soldiers. As time went on, the Pension Bureau evolved into a wider institution that processed death benefits, marriage dowries for state employees' daughters, and even medical allowances for scribes with failing eyesight. But the structure, three-stage approvals, redundant verifications, slow-moving appeals remained as it had been in the age of the Janissary. By the end of the 19th century, the archives were so vast that a clerk might spend an entire career just maintaining entries for men who had died long before his birth. These were bureaucrats working in the shadow of men they never knew, governed by forms whose origin they barely understood. Still, the ink flowed. The ledgers expanded. The paper endured. But as the Ottoman Empire teetered toward collapse in the early 20th century, and as the First World War turned scrolls into ash and palaces into ruins, one final question lingered in the dust of the old record rooms. What happens when a bureaucracy outlives the people it was meant to serve? It is 1917. The Ottoman Empire is dying. Across the once sprawling territories of the Sublime Porte, steam engines screech, sandstorms batter abandoned forts, and foreign soldiers trace lines across crumbling maps. Istanbul is a tired city, its great domes dimmed by soot and the weight of centuries. The war has drained the empire of its strength, its men, and its illusions. Yet inside a modest annex of the Ministry of Finance, a man dips his pen into an inkwell. He is 73 years old. His spectacles are cracked. The left leg of his desk wobbles slightly. He is processing a pension claim. The file in front of him is stamped Military Institutional Legacy Case. In reality, it is a Janissary pension file, one of the last. The recipient is long dead. The claim has passed through multiple hands, delayed, revised, and misplaced. But the clerk does not question its validity. The name is there. The signature is legible. The ink is faded but true. He signs his own name with care, closes the file, and ties it with a silk ribbon. The paper will go nowhere. There is no money left, but the ledger will be closed properly because that is how it has always been done. When forms become faith. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Janissary Pension Fund existed in name only. It had been officially dissolved multiple times, absorbed into civil offices, consolidated under modern administrative reforms, and eventually forgotten altogether. But like the quiet presence of ancient foundations beneath modern cities, its structures lingered. Forms once used for elite infantry became templates for tax collectors. The three-stage approval process became the standard for university payroll. Even the vocabulary endured. To file a defter still meant to enter a claim. A lost esame was used colloquially to refer to any misfiled government record. The janissaries were gone. Their barracks had become museums, ruins, and libraries, but their paper trail lived on. Not because anyone needed it to, but because no one had ever been told to stop. The last clerk. His name was Hassan Reza Effendi. He had joined the Ministry of Finance in 1863. A quiet man, known for eating the same lunch every day: boiled chickpeas, flatbread, and tea. He wore the same style of fez until it was outlawed. He retired in 1918, just before the armistice. He was the last known clerk to process a file referencing a janissary pension number. When interviewed late in life, Hassan Reza was asked why he continued working on claims that had, by all accounts, no living beneficiaries. His answer was simple: if the ledger is open, the duty remains. He believed, as so many did in the Ottoman system, that bureaucracy was not merely administration, it was stewardship. The ledger was not simply a record of who was paid, it was a record of who mattered. The Janissary legacy in the Turkish Republic. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1922 and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, sweeping administrative reforms were enacted. Ministries were consolidated. Paperwork was modernized. Arabic script was replaced with Latin, and thousands of ledgers, forms, and registers were burned, discarded, or archived without catalog. And yet, a handful of the old pension volumes survived, stored in what is now the Ottoman Archives Directorate in Istanbul. Bound in leather, yellowed with age, they sit on metal shelving in temperature-controlled rooms, unread by most, forgotten by many. Their pages contain thousands of names: men who lived, marched, and died in service of an empire that no longer exists. Some entries are meticulously complete. Others end mid-line, as if interrupted by time. One reads simply: Mustafa, son of Ali, served Edirne Fortress, 27 years, partial vision loss, application deferred. There is no follow-up, no closure, just ink dried for over a century. A different kind of monument. In history, we often remember the spectacular, the sieges, the uprisings, the royal decrees. But in reality, most empires, like most lives, are built on repetition, on dullness, on the unfailing turn of a page and the quiet scratch of a pen. The Janissary Pension Fund was not glorious. It did not expand frontiers or build palaces. It existed to ensure that an aging soldier received a small bag of silver each month. And yet, it endured longer than the very institution it served. Because sometimes the paper outlasts the sword. Sometimes the clerk is more permanent than the commander. And sometimes the most enduring stories of an empire are written not in blood but in ledger lines. So the question lingers: when all the palaces fall and the armies disband, what remains? Perhaps only the ink, and the memory that someone, somewhere, once mattered enough to be written down. Blue Book Story 3: How Paperwork Built the British Empire, The Ledger Clerks of Calcutta. It is 1851. The sun has risen over Calcutta, capital of British India. Its light spills unevenly across tiled roofs and banyan trees, touches the surface of the Hooghly River, and finally creeps up the walls of a large, rectangular structure built in red brick, the Writers' Building. From the outside, it appears imposing a colonial design with classical symmetry, pillars, iron railings, and the smell of dust baked by the Indian heat. But what lies inside is far less dramatic. This is not a place of diplomacy, military command, or scandal. It is, instead, a place of paperwork. Room after room is filled with low desks, pigeonhole filing cabinets, inkwells, and British civil servants bent over ledger books. These men, known as writers or clerks of the East India Company, are the beating heart of an empire that spans a subcontinent, not because they hold swords, but because they hold pens. You are now inside that world. Each desk contains its own universe. Rice exports from Bengal, opium yields from Bihar, land revenue in Awadh, canal inspection schedules in Punjab. Dozens of hands move in unison, quills scratching against parchment, ledgers being updated line by careful line. The silence is only broken by the soft squeak of chair legs and the occasional bark of a supervisor reminding a junior clerk that totals must be checked twice. To the outsider, it is mind-numbingly dull. To the empire, it is essential. Who were these clerks? The writers were young British men, often between the ages of 17 and 25, sent to India after passing through Haileybury College, a training school for company civil servants. They were not aristocrats, nor were they adventurers. They were accountants, copyists, administrators. Their job was to record, regulate, and rationalize every corner of Indian life that intersected with British interests. They lived in shared housing, often above the offices where they worked. They dined on boiled meat, drank weak tea, and suffered from malaria and dysentery with alarming regularity. Their companions were ink blotters and mosquito nets. A new recruit might begin by copying tax records, manually transcribing local rent receipts submitted by zamindars, the hereditary tax collectors of rural Bengal. One miscalculation could cause an entire district's revenue to appear underperforming, triggering audits, reprimands, or unnecessary military patrols. Their handwriting was so scrutinized that some men were dismissed for illegible script. One former clerk, James Elton, lamented in his diary, "The governor could not read my hand and so declared the report defective. I had spelled nothing wrong, only written it wrongly." Ledgers that measured lives. The British Empire in India was not just governed by laws or armies. It was governed by numbers. How many rupees were collected in salt tax from a village in Midnapore? How much rice was milled per unit of irrigation along the Ganges Canal? How many workers deserted a railway project in the hot season? What was the mortality rate among dock laborers in Madras during monsoon? These were not academic questions. These were questions that decided salaries, punishments, trade routes, and medical interventions. If a village's output dropped below quota, it might lose access to well subsidies. If opium profits rose, the empire expanded canal projects. Every decision flowed from figures, and those figures flowed from the quills of clerks in Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and Rangoon. To write one line in a ledger was to shape the fate of people you might never meet. Yet for the writers themselves, the task was rarely seen in such dramatic light. Their diaries and letters reveal a different perspective, one of monotony, frustration, and heat. In his 1853 correspondence, a junior clerk named Thomas Pritchard wrote, "Have spent 4 days checking sugar weights against manifest. The ships lie idle while the figures are debated." Still, they continued, because bureaucracy does not pause for boredom. Paper, bureaucracy, and imperial order. Every record required verification. One clerk would record, a second would total, a third would verify. If the entry survived all 3 levels, it was copied again by hand into the master ledger. Each of these stages might involve several days of delay, but delay was preferable to error. An error was not simply a mistake, it was disorder. The British vision of empire was not only territorial, it was clerical. Control meant making the unfamiliar legible. Villages were mapped, names were transliterated, crops were classified by productivity, hills became elevations, rivers became irrigation resources. The writer's building became the epicenter of this transformation. It housed tax documents in one wing, infrastructure logs in another, and in the back, a dark, airless room known as the Famine Bureau. Here, clerks recorded grain prices and rainfall measurements across thousands of miles. One decimal in the wrong column could result in failing to declare a region at risk, and failure to declare meant no grain relief. In this way, the clerks held a power they didn't always understand, the power to define reality through paperwork. The piles that built an empire. By 1860, British India had generated over 22 million individual ledger entries, spanning taxation, agriculture, judiciary appointments, postal routes, criminal convictions, railway surveys, and more. The writer's building maintained duplicate copies of many of these records in fireproof safes. Clerks spent decades simply updating indexes. There was no glory in it, no applause. But it worked. The empire expanded because the system scaled. The bureaucracy ensured that distant regions like Sindh, Assam, or Travancore were governed with the same documents, the same ledgers, and the same meticulous if inflexible logic. The files were formatted identically. The currency conversions were updated quarterly. The tables matched. And from this mountain of paper, the British Empire achieved its illusion of permanence. But permanence is fragile, and systems, no matter how well filed, are only as strong as the reality they attempt to contain. As the years passed and India changed, the clerks noticed things they could not quite quantify. Discontent spreading in regions where tax had been efficiently collected. Railway projects delayed not by calculation errors, but by resistance and sabotage. Discrepancies between what the paperwork declared and what the people lived. Still they filed the forms, still they signed the ledgers. But the question lingered, somewhere beneath the ruled lines and dated stamps. Can an empire built on paperwork understand the lives it tries to number? The year is 1870. The East India Company is no more absorbed into the British crown after the uprising of 1857. Queen Victoria now rules as Empress, and her face appears beside meticulously typed columns of rupees, grain, and disciplinary codes. But inside the writer's building in Calcutta, little has changed. The desks remain. The ink remains. The dust settles gently over ledgers that stretch from Bengal to Baluchistan. The clerks are no longer company men. They are imperial civil servants, but the work remains numbingly familiar. And somewhere in that stack of receipts, calculations, and census returns lies a story of slow, invisible control and the creeping dissonance between what is written and what is lived. Census and the invention of categories. In 1871, the British Empire launched its first full all-India census. It was a monumental undertaking. Millions of lives were to be counted, classified, and categorized into discrete boxes: religion, caste, occupation, literacy, landholding status. To do this, the clerks devised forms grids with pre-labeled answers. Entire villages were to be sorted into columns: Hindu, Muslim, Christian, other. The caste system, fluid and locally interpreted for centuries, was now mapped with the rigidity of ink. One British administrator in Punjab proudly declared, "We have, at last, made Hindu society legible." But what the census truly made was assumption. Villagers who had never defined themselves as one caste were labeled as such by colonial agents. Whole communities were listed under occupations they no longer performed. Fishermen became agrarian, shepherds became laborers, and wandering artisans became vagrants. The clerks, seated in their shaded offices in Calcutta, compiled these numbers into thick blue books, statistical abstracts bound with leather and optimism. Their logic was simple: what is measurable can be managed. But the measurements were never perfect, and slowly the cracks began to show. The trouble with totals. By the mid-1880s, India's rail network had exploded, built largely with data extracted by clerks. Freight routes were drawn on the basis of crop yield records. Ticket prices were calculated from provincial income logs. But when these records failed to reflect seasonal labor migration, trains sat empty while fields starved for hands. Revenue officers began reporting mismatches between projected tax income and actual collections. Some villages were abandoned, others flourished unexpectedly, but in the ledger books all remained fixed. One clerk, Charles Henderson, noted in a memo, "The people appear not to behave according to the tables prepared. We must revisit our assumptions." But assumptions are hard to revise when they form the entire foundation of administration. Rather than change the system, new forms were added: more columns, more boxes, a second census, an addendum on land tenure, an annex on rainfall. The paperwork multiplied. The writer's building, once seen as a marvel of bureaucratic clarity, became known among younger officers as the swamp. Yet still the clerks wrote on, because the logic of empire was built not on flexibility but on standardization. Paper versus people. This dissonance between record and reality came into sharp relief during the famines of the late 19th century. In 1876-1878, drought struck parts of southern and western India. The British administration relied on rainfall data, grain price charts, and food storage inventories to guide relief efforts. The clerks in Calcutta dispatched food requisitions based on per capita calculations from the previous census. They sent supplies to districts deemed at risk on paper. But the maps lied. They didn't account for local hoarding, price manipulation, failing roads, or caste-based food denial. Villages with adequate grain per household in the ledgers had, in truth, seen entire harvests rot in storage or shipped off to rail depots. In the famine's wake, reports emerged of clerks proudly citing charts that showed adequate distribution, even as thousands perished. The ink had masked the absence. A confidential internal memo from 1879 reads, "The system functioned correctly. The failure was in behavior, not bureaucracy." In this, the British administration revealed its greatest faith not in justice or responsiveness, but in formality. If the paperwork was in order, then the world must be too. And if the world was not, it was the fault of the world, not the paperwork. Clerical culture. By the 1890s, the culture of the Calcutta clerical offices had grown increasingly self-contained. Promotions were based on neatness, accuracy, and familiarity with archival systems. A man could work 40 years and never meet a single Indian citizen. Entire departments were devoted to form version control, ink procurement, and file compression through improved handwriting practices. One supervisor, proud of his team, reported that no document has been misfiled since 1867. He did not mention that the data in many of those documents was already outdated or irrelevant. A typical day for a senior clerk included: arriving at 9:00 a.m., reviewing previous day's copywork for errors in column alignment, auditing 3 ledgers for ink clarity and legibility, signing off on form distribution logs for the next week, preparing replies to queries from London about stamp color uniformity. By this time, India had more bureaucrats per capita than most parts of the British Isles. And yet, for all this order, unrest was growing. Reformist newspapers began pointing out the absurdities. One Bengali editor remarked, "They do not see us, they only see our numbers." And yet those numbers remained the empire's lens. The logic of paper prevailed. But for how much longer? Because empires may stretch across oceans. They may conquer through treaties and gunpowder. But in the end, They rest on the faith that their forms still match the world. And when that match begins to fray, what then? It is 1920. The writers' building in Calcutta still stands, but the atmosphere inside has changed. The whisper of quills has given way to the clicking of typewriters. The ledgers, once handwritten in graceful copperplate, are now riddled with carbon copies and rubber-stamped pages. Files arrive not by ox cart or messenger, but in bulging satchels carried by harried junior clerks who now take the tram to work. India is changing, and the clerks are uneasy. From outside, the cry of nationalist protests echo through the courtyard. Mahatma Gandhi has begun his campaign of non-cooperation. Indian staff have started to fill roles once reserved only for British recruits. Yet still, deep within the brick corridors of the writers' building, the ledgers are maintained with dutiful care. But something is different now. The paperwork no longer feels like power, it feels like routine. A machine running on momentum. After nearly a century of record-keeping, the colonial bureaucracy had become its own organism, one that produced documents, because that's what it had always done. Districts still filed grain reports, even when British administrators privately admitted the figures were speculative. Revenue surveys were conducted annually, despite years of poor monsoon and mass migration that rendered comparisons moot. Criminal conviction rates were tabulated with machine-like precision, even as local courts grew increasingly defiant. In 1921, a group of nationalist lawyers petitioned for tax exemptions in Bengal on the grounds that revenue registers do not reflect actual yield. The clerks rejected the claim, noting that the ledgers showed no significant variance. But behind the tidy columns, a quiet truth had emerged. The paperwork no longer aligned with the country it claimed to represent. The rise of Indian clerks. By the mid-1920s, Indians held more than 60% of the clerical positions in the imperial bureaucracy. This was not a concession, it was a necessity. The empire needed more staff than could be shipped from Britain. These new clerks, educated in British-style schools, trained in the same filing systems, and often fluent in both English and multiple Indian languages, became the unlikely heirs of the very mechanism that had once excluded them. But they saw it differently. To them, the bureaucracy was no longer sacred. It was a tool, one they could use to advocate, challenge, and even subvert. Some inserted annotations in the margins of land reports to highlight community disputes. Others used their familiarity with census categories to push for recognition of underserved castes. They weren't revolutionaries. They were record keepers. But they had begun to edit the record. When systems ceased to convince. By 1930, the British administration still prided itself on what one official called the most comprehensive filing system in the world. But outside, the world was breaking apart. Villages refused tax collection. Trains carried more pamphlets than freight. Entire districts staged paper strikes, refusing to fill out government forms as an act of resistance. Suddenly, the bureaucratic system found itself not ignored, but boycotted. Files continued to flow into Calcutta, but more and more were empty, fabricated, or returned blank. In some offices, entire weeks passed without a single accurate report, and yet the clerks filed them anyway, because the absence of data would break the system, but false data could keep it alive, at least on paper. A telling moment came in 1935, during a legislative debate in Delhi, when a British official referred confidently to a grain production figure. A young Indian member stood up and said, "That figure is fiction. We stopped reporting it last year." The room went silent. The diminishing faith in forms. The core assumption of the British colonial project was that order equaled legitimacy, and that order came from documentation. But when that documentation was no longer believed by the people, or even by the clerks themselves, the structure began to sag. By 1940, many of the old clerical procedures still persisted. Letters were still stamped, memos filed, reports bound, but even the most senior officials recognized the hollowness. In 1943, during the Bengal famine, one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern Indian history, paperwork reached its cruel nadir. Relief efforts were paralyzed not by lack of food, but by bureaucratic delays. Documents had to be verified. Tonnage limits had to be calculated. Permission for grain shipment from Punjab to Bengal required 3 levels of clearance, each filed in triplicate. By the time approval was granted, thousands had already starved. A lone memo survives from that year, written by an anonymous clerk. The forms are complete, the people are not. After the empire, India gained independence in 1947. The British left, but the paperwork remained. In the newly formed Republic of India, the Writers' Building continued to house government offices. The ledgers were not burned. They were inherited. The bureaucracy, imperfect, inflexible, deeply colonial in origin, became the administrative skeleton of a new nation. For decades, Indian civil servants continued to use forms designed by colonial offices. Pension schemes, land records, and water distribution plans all bore the same structure. The legacy of the clerks outlived the empire they served. But something had changed. The new clerks no longer believed the paper told the whole story. They had learned the limitations of the ledger. And in time, they began to design new forms. Final reflections. The British Empire in India was not sustained by force alone. It was maintained through files, through ruled lines, monthly tallies, and an unshakable belief in the clarity of ink. Yet the story of those files is not one of triumph. It is one of gradual misalignment, where paperwork continued long after it had lost touch with the people it measured. The Writers' Building still stands in Kolkata today. Its red facade has been restored. Its halls are quieter. Tourists walk through its rooms, often unaware that this was once the nerve center of an empire built not with cannons but with carbon paper. There are no statues of the clerks. No grand plaques. Just old rooms, filled with the ghosts of records once considered too important to question. So we ask, when does administration become inertia? And what happens when a system continues to file papers for a world that has already changed? Blue Book Story 4, a very dusty affair. The Parliament cleaning staff of 19th century France. It is 7:10 a.m. in Paris, 1847. Outside the Palais Bourbon, where the French Chamber of Deputies convenes, the gas lamps are being extinguished. Horses clatter past the Seine. The city yawns into life. But inside the tall columns and shadowed hallways of the building, another form of order has already begun: the daily cleaning of the lower house of Parliament. The elected officials are not due for another 3 hours, but the asterisk service d'entretien et propreté, the House Maintenance Division, has already been at work since 5:00 a.m. These are not guards or secretaries. They are not civil servants in the traditional sense. These are sweepers, dusters, polishers, and ash pan carriers. They wear no uniform save for smocks. Their names rarely appear in parliamentary records, but they are responsible for making the National Assembly not only function, but survive. Because without them, the Chamber of Deputies would choke on its own dust. A building not meant to breathe. The Palais Bourbon, completed in the early 18th century and repurposed for legislative sessions after the French Revolution, is grand but difficult. Its design is heavy with drapery, wood paneling, thick velvet chairs, and carpeted floors, all of which trap and multiply dust. Even by the standards of the 19th century, the building was considered problematic for hygiene. A medical official in 1849 described it as a place of dense, recycled air, too stagnant for reason. The heating was unreliable. The air was dry. The smell of old tobacco lingered like memory itself. And so before the debates began, an entire economy of cleaning emerged. Quiet, regular, invisible. Each morning, dozens of workers filed into the palais through a side entrance. Many of them were women, some widows of civil servants, others relatives of lower-level guards. They carried brooms made of birch, damp cloths, wax pots, and tin scoops. Their instructions were rarely written. Most had learned by watching. But the rules were rigid. Begin in the hemicycle, the semicircular chamber, moving from back benches to front, always clockwise. Dust the tops of all voting desks with damp cloth, only no polish. Replace used ink blotters. Empty the brass ashtrays, but do not discard unburned cigars. Sweep beneath the ministerial benches, but never touch official documents, even if fallen. Clean the speaker's platform last. There were no exceptions, not even for fallen flags or mouse droppings beneath the rostrum. A ritual of silence. This daily cleaning was conducted in total quiet. Orders were whispered. Buckets were placed on felt pads. Shoes were padded with cloth. The goal was simple, complete invisibility. Some staff timed their tasks by counting the ticks of the large wall clock. One pass of the broom equals 3 ticks. A row of desks equals 24 ticks. It was said that the palais could be fully dusted in precisely 97 minutes if no interruptions occurred. Interruptions did occur. Papers misplaced. Candelabras knocked loose. One staff member once left a wax pot open beneath a bench, which later caused a deputy's trousers to adhere to the seat. She was reassigned to outer corridors. Their work was essential, but never discussed. One chamber cleaner, Jean-Marie Leduc, wrote in a private letter to her sister in 1852, "We remove the day's arguments before they begin. The men debate on polished wood, unaware of the black beneath their shoes." The war on dust. What is often forgotten in discussions of 19th century politics is the role of dust. Paris, long before the modern era of sanitation, was awash in it. Horse dung, chimney soot, powdered wigs, and urban construction all contributed to a haze of particulates that settled in every crevice. In the Palais Bourbon, dust had political consequences. In 1843, an official inquiry into the collapse of a marble step revealed that it had been weakened by years of unnoticed moisture trapped beneath accumulated debris. In 1850, several deputies contracted persistent coughs attributed to mold and allergens in the carpeted hallways. The Speaker of the Chamber once delayed a session after declaring that this chamber is not fit for breathing, let alone governance. And so the cleaning staff were quietly elevated not in title, but in responsibility. The head chambermaid was instructed to submit daily dust reports, brief, handwritten notes indicating the presence of excess particles, unidentifiable residues, or signs of vermin activity. These reports were filed but never read, until, in 1856, a small fire broke out in the central archive room. It was quickly extinguished, but not before it destroyed several voting ledgers. In the aftermath, it was discovered that the cleaners had logged the scent of scorched papers 3 days prior, but no one had responded. From then on, the dust reports were read daily by an undersecretary. Invisible authority. Despite their silence, the cleaners had preferences and subtle power. A cleaner might spend slightly more time on the desk of a deputy known to be polite. Certain areas were mopped more thoroughly in summer, when certain ministers were known to perspire. Some chambermaids would leave a slightly folded blotter as a signal that the ink pot had dried. Rumors circulated that one floor polisher kept a mental log of which deputies smoked the cheapest cigars. These small acts were never acknowledged, but they shaped the working conditions of those who shaped the country. In this way, the The cleaning staff created a parallel system of order, one not based on votes or speeches, but on sweeping patterns, wax rhythms, and the maintenance of an illusion of cleanliness and function. Without them, the grand theater of parliamentary life would falter, because no matter how elegant the debates, they still happened in a room made of wood, dust, and ash. And so we ask, can democracy function if the floorboards are left to rot? It is 1862, and the Palais Bourbon hums with preparations. Today, a foreign envoy will observe the Chamber of Deputies in session. The Speaker's dais has been wiped down twice. Extra lamps have been polished, and beneath the feet of hurried staff and tailcoat-clad officials, a crew of unseen workers has already completed their most important task of the day: the removal of 17 cigar ends, 8 soiled blotters, 3 forgotten handkerchiefs, and a modest trail of dried horse dung tracked in on a boot. Welcome to the backstage of democracy. In this world of speeches, oratory, and parliamentary performance, there existed a supporting force with no voice, no recognition, and yet total necessity. The service d'entretien, responsible for the physical maintenance of the French Chamber of Deputies, was not an official arm of governance, but without it, governance could not occur. And as the century wore on, their role only deepened in complexity. Waste and its management. Debates in the chamber were long, often heated, and always smoky. Deputies smoked cigars during sessions until 1875, a tradition considered essential to masculine deliberation. The side effect: ash, and a lot of it. The ash posed a curious challenge. If swept too early, it disturbed ongoing discussions. If left too long, it stained the carpets. The cleaners developed a ritual. During short breaks, a designated ash porter would walk the hemicycle with a silver ash pan, wearing soft leather soles and carrying a damp cloth. This task required absolute discretion. Deputies were never to be touched, never to be spoken to, and never to be startled. Ash was to be collected without interrupting thought, an act of near invisibility. One porter, Jules Amiel, served in this role for 14 years. He claimed he knew the personalities of deputies by the texture of their ashes. When he retired, he was replaced by a former chimney sweep. Furniture maintenance and the politics of polish. Beyond ash, there was wax, and wax was political. The chamber's floors were covered in parquet wood tiles, sensitive to both moisture and overpolishing. If waxed too frequently, the floors became slick, leading to embarrassment. If left dull, they reflected poorly on national pride. Every 3 days, teams of 2 would polish the main aisle using long-handled brushes made from horsehair, soaked in a beeswax and turpentine solution. But it was not only floors. Desks were oiled. Chair arms were checked for splinters. Upholstered benches were beaten clean in the rear courtyard using wooden paddles not too hard, lest they release their stuffing. The red curtains behind the speaker's chair were brushed daily, lest dust settle in folds and flutter visibly during speeches. These decisions mattered, not because the deputies noticed, but because the public did. Parliamentary sessions were sometimes observed from the upper gallery. Diplomats, journalists, and university students watched debates unfold from on high. A scuffed table or a crooked carpet fringe could spark ridicule in the press. And if a deputy were to trip, a minor scandal. Thus, the cleaning staff developed a checklist culture long before the term existed. Every section of the chamber had a designated staff member with specific responsibility. It was said the Palais Bourbon was cleaned not by floor, but by function. Cleaning by the clock. A typical day for a senior cleaner such as Madame Henriette Fournier, documented in a payroll sheet from 1866, began at 4:45 a.m. Her tasks were regimented to the minute. 4:50 a.m. unlock storage closet, retrieve wax pot and cloth bundle. 5:00 a.m. begin floor sweep, chamber perimeter first. 5:35 a.m. wipe railing of public gallery, Check for chewing tobacco residue. 6:00 a.m. Replace spittoon liners, 15 total. 6:30 a.m. Inspect curtain folds, dust any visible pollen. 6:55 a.m. Report to concierge with notes on damage, odor, or abnormalities. 7:15 a.m. Retreat to East Corridor before secretaries arrive. These times were not formalized by document, but by tradition. The cleaning corps passed down rhythms like recipes. When a staff member was replaced, they were trained not with manuals, but with walks shadowing their predecessor across floor tiles, learning the proper angle to dust a minister's lectern without disturbing the desk bell. This oral knowledge was sacred. It was how the cleaning regime preserved order even as political regimes rose and fell. Political transitions and physical continuity. Between 1830 and 1870, France shifted between monarchy, republic, and empire. Governments collapsed. Constitutions were rewritten. But the Palais Bourbon never stopped hosting lawmakers, and the cleaning crew never missed a day. In fact, during the revolutionary unrest of 1848, when parts of Paris were barricaded and blood ran through the Place de la Concorde, the cleaning staff of the chamber still arrived before sunrise. They swept around broken glass. They polished desks that might never be used again. And then the next government moved in, and the staff were already waiting. As a young deputy reportedly said in 1850, "Governments change, Henriette does not." This constancy was intentional. The cleaning staff were hired through quiet back channels, often connected to long-serving administrative families. They did not participate in partisan activity. If asked about politics, they declined to answer. It was not cowardice, it was preservation. The Republic needed pillars. Sometimes those pillars wore smocks and carried broomsticks. The dust files. In 1869, a peculiar initiative was launched by an overzealous deputy secretary for building affairs. He requested weekly sanitation summaries from the cleaning crew, written reports on dust levels, waste volume, odor, and atmospheric clarity. The cleaning staff complied, reluctantly. The resulting files, now preserved in the French National Archives, are charmingly dull. Tuesday, Feb 4, slight mildew near rear heating vent, no action taken. Friday, May 17, speaker's cushion required replacement, smelled of anchovy. Monday, Sep 9, ash bins full, Deputy Morris appears to have changed brands. But hidden within the monotony are moments of human insight, hints of what it meant to maintain the stage of politics without ever stepping into its light. Because the cleaning staff, more than anyone, saw the chamber before and after. They saw it in the silence before the oration, and in the mess left behind when the votes were cast. So we wonder, is power truly found in words? Or does it reside in those who prepare the place where words are spoken? It is late evening in Paris, March 1871. Inside the Palais Bourbon, the seats are empty. The gas lamps have been extinguished. The papers have been left in neat, if hurried, stacks. Outside, in the streets of Paris, the Commune has begun. But within the Chamber of Deputies, a woman with cracked hands and soft shoes is sweeping near the speaker's dais. She is not a politician. She is a cleaner. And tonight, for the first time in 29 years, she does not know if she will return tomorrow. This is not the story of one political upheaval. It is the story of many, and how the cleaning staff of the French National Assembly managed to survive all of them. Not through protest, not through ideology, but through the quiet ritual of wiping the slate clean, again and again, no matter who shouted from the rostrum hours before. Survival through subtlety. From the July monarchy to the Second Republic, from Napoleon III's Second Empire to the Commune, and eventually the Third Republic, the Palais Bourbon hosted a revolving door of regimes. Each government brought new speeches, New flags, new slogans. But the dust stayed the same. The cleaning staff were rarely dismissed even in times of civil war because no one thought of them as political. They were fixtures, like the benches or the doors, and so they became witnesses to history, quietly adjusting their routines as new governments arrived. In 1852, when Napoleon III transformed the assembly into a stage for imperial pageantry, the cleaning staff were instructed to begin polishing brass railings previously left matte. In 1870, as the Second Empire collapsed, they reverted to dusting only the woodwork, lest the remaining supplies be seen as symbols of luxury. During the short but intense period of the Paris Commune in 1871, the Palais Bourbon was briefly abandoned. When the National Assembly returned weeks later, the cleaning staff were among the first allowed inside to reclaim the space. Their first report read, "Hall largely intact, mold along windowsills, documents found scattered in room 7, began sweeping at 7:10 a.m. No outrage, no complaint, just the work. Institutional memory in a mop handle." By the 1880s, the Palais Bourbon had settled into its role under the Third Republic. The cleaning staff now included a few male porters, but it remained primarily a team of older women. Some had served since before the 1848 revolution. Their knowledge of the building was unparalleled. They knew which windows stuck in winter, which benches creaked under the heaviest deputies, where mice nested near the heating vents, which wallpaper absorbed smoke too easily. They also remembered personalities, which minister drank spiced wine, which deputy always left crumbs, which visiting dignitary refused to use the provided ink blotters. None of this was written down, but it was all remembered. In this way, the cleaning staff held a kind of oral institutional memory, an archive of habits and patterns that never entered the formal record, but shaped the chamber nonetheless. And occasionally, this memory influenced politics. In 1886, a deputy complained that his seat was unclean. The cleaning supervisor replied that the problem was not her staff, but the new wool trousers that shed more than they sit. The complaint was withdrawn. Power speaks loudly, but knowledge whispers, and it is often carried by those whose names are never read aloud. The ghosts of dust. As the 19th century waned, so too did many of the original staff. Some retired quietly, others died in service. Their positions were filled by daughters, nieces, and widows. By 1890, the cleaning staff had developed their own internal rites. A small candle lit each All Saints' Day for former coworkers. A chart of mop angles passed down like a family secret. Nicknames for particularly troublesome desks, e.g., the shedder, Monsieur Ink Blot. A private bench in the East Corridor for midday rest unofficial, but never questioned. One cleaner, Marcel Guérin, was said to pause after each shift and whisper, "Now let them lie to each other in peace." No one knows if she believed this cynically or with affection. But she was not alone in sensing the emotional residue of the chamber. Though rarely mentioned, the cleaners spoke privately of what they called debate dust, a fine, nearly invisible layer of grime that seemed to appear after particularly intense sessions. It wasn't just ash or lint. It was, in their words, the weight of words. They scrubbed it just the same. After hours, when the day's work was done and the deputies had left, the Palais Bourbon was silent. And in that silence, the cleaners walked the halls like caretakers of a monument both eternal and absurd. They moved past busts of former leaders, often chipped. They straightened portraits of fallen regimes. They mopped beneath flags that had changed colors more than once. They dusted shelves containing the laws of yesterday, now irrelevant. And through it all, they maintained a simple truth. Nothing lasts, not empires, not ideologies, not orations. But perhaps for a time, a clean floor can. A reflection of real power. By the close of the 19th century, the Palais Bourbon had modernized. Electric lighting was introduced. Ventilation improved. The ash pans were retired. But the cleaning staff remained, adapting as always, their work still uncelebrated, still essential. They were never commemorated, never thanked from the podium. Their job was not to be seen. And yet they had kept the very space of democracy from decay. They had preserved function through care, not through law. They were the stewards of continuity in a chamber obsessed with change. So perhaps the final question of this story is not who held the most power in the chamber, but rather who ensured there was a chamber at all. Blue Book Story 5, the treaty that nobody argued about, the Convention of London, 1840. It is July 15, 1840. A small stack of neatly folded papers sits atop a walnut writing desk in a nondescript room within the Foreign Office on Downing Street, London. Outside, the streets are muddy with early summer drizzle. Inside, a handful of ministers, envoys, and secretaries review the final phrasing of a treaty that, if all goes to plan, will end a conflict no one particularly wanted to talk about. This is not a moment of triumph. There are no cheering crowds, no triumphant signatures, no ceremonial gestures, no champagne corks or newsboys shouting headlines. Instead, there is quiet agreement, neat handwriting, and deliberate avoidance of emotional expression. The document is called the Convention of London, and it concerns the political future of the Ottoman Empire specifically, a conflict between the Ottoman Sultan and his rebellious vassal, Muhammad Ali of Egypt. But this is not a story about war. This is a story about the most boring kind of diplomacy, a piece of paper created, edited, and signed by people who hope to solve a global problem by quietly filing it away. The background everyone knew but did discuss. To understand the convention, one must first understand the war it was meant to end. The Second Egyptian-Ottoman War, 1839-1841. A brief, not quite global, not quite regional conflict that stemmed from Muhammad Ali Pasha's ambition to extend his Egyptian authority into Syria and Anatolia, weakening the Ottoman Empire in the process. But European powers, especially Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, did not want a total collapse of the Ottoman regime. They feared instability. They feared Russian overreach. They feared French adventurism. But more than anything, they feared paperwork, what would happen to the thousands of trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and canal negotiations if the Ottoman Empire disintegrated. No one wanted to send troops. No one wanted speeches. Everyone wanted order. Thus, the Convention of London was born not as a great diplomatic initiative, but as a filing solution. A treaty of tidy compromise. The signatories, representatives of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, met over the course of weeks in quiet rooms, debating phrasing more than principle. Muhammad Ali would withdraw from Syria, which he had conquered. He would retain hereditary control of Egypt, formalizing a system already in practice. The Ottoman Sultan, meanwhile, would remain sovereign, but under the protective umbrella of the European status quo. No power would gain anything, but neither would they lose face. The discussions were cordial, dull, and focused heavily on terminology. The wording of the title governor of Egypt was debated for 4 days. The inclusion of the word perpetual versus hereditary led to 14 drafts. No one raised their voice. A British undersecretary in attendance wrote in his journal, "It is, perhaps, the most emotionally vacant process I have yet witnessed, refreshing in its banality." The final version of the convention was printed on thick vellum paper, bound in blue cloth, and stored in a lacquered wooden box that had previously held an agricultural tax agreement with Denmark. No public debates. Unlike other treaties that stirred patriotic fervor or parliamentary debate, The Convention of London was almost entirely ignored by the public. British newspapers reported it with a single paragraph on page 3. French newspapers grumbled, but largely focused on opera schedules. Ottoman scribes translated the document with minimal commentary. Why? Because no one stood to gain a clear victory. There were no dramatic maps to redraw, no reparations, no heroics. Even the French, who supported Muhammad Ali, expressed irritation but did not escalate. Their ambassador merely filed a note of protest, which was added to the treaty folder and later misplaced. This lack of attention was intentional. The treaty had been designed to avoid confrontation not just militarily, but rhetorically. The powers involved believed that quiet settlement was the best outcome. They did not seek to reshape the world. They sought to stabilize it in place. And so they did by smoothing the rough edges of empire with parchment and patience. The logistics of agreement. The actual signing ceremony was held in a small drawing room with refreshments. No translators were needed. All representatives spoke French, the diplomatic lingua franca. The signing lasted less than 10 minutes. Afterward, there was no formal dinner. A few ministers had tea. The signed documents were then duplicated by hand, with copies sent to each capital. Each one was placed in a wax-sealed envelope marked with a ribbon in the national color of the recipient. For archival purposes, an additional copy was filed in the Foreign Office record room, where it was stored beside a forgotten Anglo-Dutch fishing dispute file from 1812. There it remained dusty, unconsulted, and perfectly preserved. A British archivist noted, 50 years later, "This agreement contains no famous lines, no celebrated clauses. It was a peace forged by the unremarkable." And in this way it succeeded. When diplomacy is meant to be boring, the Convention of London stands as a historical oddity not for what it achieved, but for how uneventfully it achieved it. It settled a potentially explosive crisis without armies clashing on European soil. It prevented a breakdown in global trade routes. It stabilized a weakening Ottoman Empire for several more decades. But perhaps most importantly, it proved that not all diplomacy must be dramatic. Some of it, perhaps the most effective kind, happens in quiet rooms, between people who would rather reach agreement than appear victorious. It is diplomacy as housekeeping, cautious, unambitious, yet necessary. And so we ask, can the most lasting peace be the one no one remembers? By August 1840, the final signatures of the Convention of London had dried. The ink, carefully selected by the British Foreign Office for its resistance to smudging, held neatly beneath each name: Palmerston for Britain, Metternich for Austria, and equally tidy counterparts from Prussia and Russia. Each signature elegant, each penned with the calm confidence of men who did not expect their names to be remembered for this. And indeed they were. There were no medals awarded for the treaty, no monuments, no parliamentary portraits of the negotiators in heroic postures. The entire convention would soon slide quietly into a manila folder marked "Eastern Question Resolved Temporarily." Yet in its dullness, it accomplished what many treaties do not. It worked. A settlement of phrases, not principles. The convention didn't try to solve the Eastern Question, a term European powers used to describe the long, slow weakening of the Ottoman Empire. Instead, it paused the unraveling, like placing a paperweight on a stack of loose documents during a strong breeze. The Ottomans would keep their territorial integrity. Muhammad Ali would keep Egypt and Sudan, now formally recognized as hereditary. The European powers would keep the balance unshaken. And no one would have to redraw a single border. The negotiation process had been one of linguistic choreography. Each phrase was massaged to avoid appearing too supportive or too condemnatory. For example, Muhammad Ali was not defeated, he was reconciled. The Sultan did not cede, he recognized. The agreement was not a settlement, but a convention. The parties did not insist, they understood. The final document reads more like a bureaucratic sigh than a declaration of unity. But it was this exact tone, measured, bloodless, carefully hedged, that made it acceptable to all. A Prussian envoy reportedly said, "No one feels triumphant. That is how I know it will hold." The almost missing party. There was, however, one notable absence at the negotiating table: France. France had supported Muhammad Ali, seeing Egypt as a modernizing ally and a potential counterbalance to British influence in the eastern Mediterranean. But when the other powers moved ahead with the convention, France was left out. Did this spark war? No. Instead, France responded with mild indignation, followed by limited diplomatic sulking. The French press criticized the treaty as Anglo-centric and accused Britain of forcing the continent into a dusty alliance of caution. But there was no rupture, no blockade, no ultimatums. The matter was debated in the French Chamber of Deputies with lukewarm passion and then set aside. Britain, for its part, extended private reassurances that the convention was not meant to isolate France and that any necessary adjustments could be discussed. In time, France issued its own separate recognition of the arrangement. Thus, even the disagreement around the convention was deeply forgettable. Paperwork as preventative policy. In the months following the treaty signing, a curious pattern emerged. Reports from Alexandria, Constantinople, Beirut, and Acre showed that the terms of the convention were being quietly implemented. There were no parades, no sudden troop withdrawals. Instead, there was filing. Egyptian and Ottoman officials exchanged correspondence about provincial handovers. Trade inspectors updated customs office signage. Military posts received sealed orders delivered by courier, signed in triplicate. In at least one port, a small flag exchange took place between a Syrian outpost and an Ottoman regiment. The old flag was folded respectfully. No speeches were made. This was not diplomacy driven by charisma or moral crusade. It was driven by clerical diligence, a treaty carried out by mid-ranking administrators, dockmasters, and provincial accountants. A British naval officer stationed off the Syrian coast described the process. "There is no fighting, only forms." An empire rescued by the filing cabinet. The Ottoman Empire, by 1840, was already suffering from long-term institutional weakness. But the convention gave it breathing space, not because it solved its internal problems, but because it removed a crisis from its desk. Sultan Abdulmesid I, who had just ascended to the throne at age 16, was in no position to lead a counteroffensive against Egypt. The treaty allowed him to quietly sideline the military crisis and focus on a different project, the Tanzimat, or reorganization period, which introduced sweeping and slow reforms across the empire. The Convention of London, then, didn't just prevent war. It enabled bureaucratic reform, the true ambition of many European statesmen. And yet no one credited the treaty, not even the Ottomans. It was too boring, too tidy, forgotten success. Within a decade, the Convention of London was already being misremembered. Later treaties around the Eastern question, such as the Treaty of Paris, 1856, or the Congress of Berlin, 1878, would generate far more attention, involve great names like Bismarck and Disraeli, and produce maps covered in redrawing. But the 1840 convention, it was filed, not celebrated. It existed as a pause, a well-organized breath before more complex storms. There were no commemorative medals minted, no paintings commissioned. Most foreign offices placed the treaty in subfolders beneath more flamboyant agreements. Yet the convention held. It worked. For 20 years, the Eastern Mediterranean remained stable enough to delay further European intervention. For 20 years, the Ottoman Empire retained its borders thanks not to war, but to four men signing a dull document with matching pens. So we ask, does a treaty need to be remembered to be successful? Or is the highest mark of diplomatic achievement to leave nothing to clean up? It is 1862, 22 years after the Convention of London was signed. In a quiet, lamplit corner of the British Foreign Office's archives, a junior clerk named Henry Whittle thumbs through an aging leather-bound folder labeled Ottoman Affairs, Eastern Division. He is searching for a tax treaty appendix from 1841, but pauses when he comes across a much earlier document, a well-preserved copy of the convention, stamped and sealed, still resting in its original ribbon-tied folder. He reads the names, notes the delicate penmanship, and flips through the pages. Then he closes it, returns it to the shelf, and continues on his way. This moment, mundane, quiet, entirely unremarkable, perfectly captures the fate of one of the 19th century's most effective and most forgettable international agreements. It was never referenced in great diplomatic memoirs. It was not cited in landmark speeches. Its anniversary passed without comment. But the Convention of London had done what it was designed to do, hold things together just long enough without demanding credit. The treaty that made no enemies. In diplomatic history, most treaties are known for what they settled and who they angered. But the Convention of London achieved something rarer. It created no martyrs, no headlines, no domestic backlash. The Ottoman Empire kept its sovereignty. Muhammad Ali kept hereditary control of Egypt. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia preserved the geopolitical balance. Even France, though momentarily annoyed, quietly moved on. No territory was annexed, no indemnities demanded. The terms were not enforced through cannon fire or coercion, but through the weight of consensus and routine. This made the convention both effective and unmemorable. When crises don't escalate, history often forgets to record them. Bureaucracy as strategy. One of the peculiar strengths of the convention lay in its bureaucratic architecture. The negotiation was rooted in administrative calm. It was drafted by middle-ranking envoys, not grand statesmen. Edited for clarity, not style. Reviewed for filing integrity, not rhetorical flair. Translated into Turkish, French, German, and Arabic without delay or drama. Once ratified, its clauses were broken into digestible bureaucratic directives, orders to provincial governors, customs inspectors, and military officers. These were not framed as triumphs, but as routine instructions. There was no need to sell the treaty to the public. It was absorbed into the daily business of imperial governance like rainfall into soil. Egypt becomes a dynasty. Perhaps the most profound and least appreciated legacy of the convention was its formal recognition of hereditary rule in Egypt. Though nominally a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan, Muhammad Ali and his descendants gained de facto independence. Cairo minted its own coins, levied its own taxes, and signed trade agreements. Over time, Egypt would become a semi-autonomous dynastic state governed by Muhammad Ali's lineage until the 1950s. This arrangement, established by a treaty no one talked about, would shape Middle Eastern geopolitics for over a century. Yet no statue exists to commemorate this clause. No Egyptian history textbook titles a chapter after the convention. It was a foundational decision made without fanfare. The paper trail that faded. By the 1880s, diplomatic references to the convention had essentially disappeared. It was not cited during the Congress of Berlin. It did not appear in British imperial retrospectives. Even detailed Ottoman histories often skipped over it in favor of more dramatic turning points. The document itself was misfiled at least twice, once under Mediterranean naval matters, and once under Franco-Ottoman incidents, resolved. It remained in excellent condition, but was rarely opened. And yet, despite this fatting, the treaty had served its purpose. It prevented a larger war. It maintained regional order. It stabilized a dynasty. It bought the Ottoman Empire time to initiate reforms. It allowed the European powers to return to their other distractions. Its success lay not in what it changed, but in what it postponed. And that is perhaps the rarest kind of diplomatic success. Quiet diplomacy in a loud world. Today, in an age of televised summits, public ultimatums, and treaty photo ops, the Convention of London seems almost alien. It was a treaty crafted in longhand, debated in measured tones, and signed without even the flash of a camera, which, by 1840, still required several minutes of exposure time. There were no sound bites, no editorials, no dissents, only ink, signatures, and silence. But maybe that's the point. History tends to celebrate conflict and noise. But what if the real strength of diplomacy lies in its capacity to disappear, to slip into place like a cog in a larger machine, maintaining balance so subtly that no one ever notices? And if so, perhaps the final legacy of the Convention of London is not that it solved a crisis, but that it prevented one from becoming interesting. Blue Book Story 6. The clockmaker of Zurich who never changed his methods, 1762-1817. In the year 1793, a time of revolution, thunderous manifestos, and collapsing monarchies, the tiny workshop of Johann Alder in Zurich remained unshaken. Inside a room no larger than a modest pantry, Johann sat hunched over a wooden table, its surface nicked and darkened by oil, filings, and the stray prick of a tool. He worked by daylight only, and when that failed, he went to bed. He rose with the sun, wound the clocks he had completed the day before, and began again. Day in, day out, for 50 years. Johann Alder was a clockmaker, not a famous one, not an inventor or a visionary or a patron of horological innovation. He made clocks, ordinary clocks, some large, some small, some for homes, some for workshops, each built to order, using the same tools, same oils, and most notably the same methods he had used since 1767. He did not innovate. He did not modernize. And in doing so, Johann Alder became something else entirely, a quiet monument to consistency in a world addicted to change. The art of no improvement. Alder's approach to his craft was defined by one decision: to never deviate from what already worked. He used a hand-forged brass gear template made in 1765, a lathe turned by a leather belt strapped to a foot pedal, polishing stones that had dulled but still functioned, a caliper with hand-etched markings slightly off but predictable, a journal where he recorded each clock's creation date, buyer, and spring tension, written with the same duck-quill pen for over 30 years. He did not subscribe to trade journals. He never visited Geneva, despite its prominence in Swiss watchmaking. He refused to use new alloys or imported springs. When offered a mainspring from Paris touted as self-lubricating, he examined it and said, "If it needs no oil, it is lying." His tools were worn but known. His patterns were proven. And so he made each clock with the calmness of someone content to repeat a perfect sentence again and again. Orders from the ordinary. Unlike famous horologists of the time, who created masterpieces for kings and museums, Alder's clientele were farmers, teachers, mill owners, and provincial priests. He never built a marine chronometer. He never signed his name on a clock face. He charged by weight and size, not by complexity. If a customer asked for embellishments, he would simply quote a higher price and longer wait time. Most declined. Johann preferred it that way. The clocks he made marked the start of sermons in quiet country churches. tracked baking times in bakery basements, served as wedding gifts, retirement gifts, or first property tokens, sat, sometimes forgotten, on the mantels of modest homes ticking on, quietly asserting the passage of time. And when they broke, Johann would repair them, not always happily but reliably. "Your clock is wrong," a customer once said. Johann replied, "No, your floor is tilted." He was often right. Time passes, older does. By the early 1800s, Switzerland's watchmaking industry was shifting rapidly. The French Revolution had sent skilled craftsmen fleeing across borders. Industrial tools were arriving from England. Precision improved. Techniques diversified. The world changed. But Alder's shop did not. He still used whale oil for his gears. Still shaved hairspring coils by touch. Still made one clock at a time, never overlapping projects. Young apprentices in Zurich spoke of him with mild curiosity, unsure whether to admire or dismiss him. "The one who never changes," they called him. Even as new factories opened with assembly line precision, Alder stuck to his rituals. He continued to sharpen his tools each Monday, begin his first gear at exactly 7:30 a.m., take lunch precisely at midday, bread, cheese, and warm cider. Stop working the moment sunlight faded. Record the day's work in his leather-bound book with that same fatting pen. He never married, lived in the same apartment above the shop his father had leased, died in the same bed where he had been born. When asked if he feared becoming obsolete, Alder reportedly answered, "Time will always need a place to sit." Stability as legacy. At the end of his life in 1817, Johann Alder had produced just under 800 clocks, each one logged, repaired, and remembered. Many still exist today in private homes across Switzerland, often without attribution. They are not ornate, not collectible, not rare. But they tick. Some have been ticking for over 2 centuries, with minimal maintenance. A few still sit in corners of village churches, their chimes marking hours no one listens to anymore, except perhaps the cleaning staff. And if open, these clocks reveal no signature, no innovation, just sturdy brass, careful balance, and gears shaped by a man who believed that timekeeping was not about perfection, but repetition. So here's the question. In a world that celebrates invention, what do we lose by forgetting those who chose to never change at all? The inside of Johann Alder's workshop smelled of brass dust, walnut shavings, and whale oil. It was not a place of industry, it was a place of routine. A narrow window faced the alley. Its frame, warped ever so slightly by rain and cold over the decades, filtered in just enough morning light to cast thin, focused stripes across his workbench. Alder adjusted his stool, as he always did, with a slight turn to the right. Then, after a moment of stillness, he would reach for the same tool, his smallest gear file, worn down nearly to its handle. He didn't think of this as ceremony. He thought of it as starting the day. For Johann Alder, every clock began in the same way, with the smallest part. Not the largest gear, nor the hands, but the center pinion, a modest wheel no more than the size of a thumbnail, its teeth filed one by one. This was how a day was built. How one man kept time for a town. In the early 1800s, Zurich was growing, but slowly. The city had only recently joined the Helvetic Republic, then resisted it, and then rejoined the Swiss Confederation. While politics rattled in the background, daily life remained bound to rhythms both seasonal and mechanical. In most homes, time was not kept by personal watches; those were expensive, often imported and fragile. Instead, entire neighborhoods relied on wall clocks, mantel clocks, or a village tower bell. Many of those clocks came from Alder's workshop. The blacksmith 2 streets over rose each morning to the chime of an Alder clock mounted on a wall beam, its chime echoing in the wooden rafters. A midwife, known for her punctuality, swore by an alder clock whose tick had measured every contraction she had ever waded through. Even the town magistrate, who received far more expensive timepieces from Geneva, was known to glance at the alder model in his hallway before leaving for court. These clocks were not beautiful. Alder refused embellishment beyond a gently carved casing and his signature, etched on the inside of the back plate, visible only when the clock was opened for cleaning. But they were known for their steadiness, known for resisting dust, moisture, and neglect, known for not needing to be wound more than once every 8 days. This, Alder often said, was the greatest compliment. If you remember the clock more than the time it gives you, I have failed. Repairs and recollections. In addition to building, Alder also repaired. Customers would arrive sheepishly with clocks they or their children had mishandled. He would say little, simply gesture to the table and begin his inspection. A clock was not judged for its fall, it was judged for how it recovered. He repaired clocks warped by fireplace heat, clocks that had been dropped in buckets, clocks scratched by cats, clocks whose owners had attempted improvements. Once a schoolteacher brought in an alder clock that had stopped ticking after a decade. Johann opened the casing, examined the gears, and found that nothing was broken. He simply cleaned it, re-oiled it, and wound it. It started again. Why did it stop? The teacher asked. Alder replied, it was waiting to be noticed. His shop ledger, which survives today in the Zurich Cantonal Archive, lists 412 documented repairs, nearly all of them for clocks he had built. Some entries are remarkably precise. Number 241 cleaned, new suspension spring, customer overwound due to absent-mindedness. Number 387, cat hair and escapement. Number 111 returned after 16 years, no fault, owner uncertain why he came. Each repair was treated with as much care as a new build. Time, Alder believed, was sacred even when it faltered. Visitors, apprentices, and one stubborn master. Although Johann worked alone for most of his career, he occasionally took on young visitors, local boys curious about his tools, or journeymen who wanted a taste of the old ways. But few stayed. Alder would teach them to file a tooth, then file another, and another, and another. Some left within a week, frustrated by the slowness. One boy's hands lasted nearly 2 years before finally leaving to work in a Geneva workshop with new tools and faster hands. Johann offered no farewell, only a nod. He did not argue for his methods. He did not lament the loss. His belief was simple. The fastest way to lose time is to chase it. He didn't hate progress, he just didn't trust it. He believed that time measured life, not just hours, and life to him was steady, linear, and filled with small, purposeful movements. Why would a man rush to measure that? When the clockmaker paused. In late 1816, Alder fell ill for the first time in decades. Nothing dramatic, just a lingering fatigue, a slow breathlessness that crept into his routine. And still he worked. He made his final clock in February 1817, a tall case model for a widow in the nearby village of Adliswil. The face was plain, the bell soft, the mechanism flawless. It took him nearly 4 weeks, twice as long as usual, but it kept time exactly. When the customer came to collect it, Alder handed it over without a word and closed his workshop door for the last time. He died 4 weeks later, in the room above the shop, at age 75. No funeral was recorded, no obituary written. But those who owned his clocks noticed something strange that spring. Several of their clocks ran exactly 1 minute slow. It wasn't mechanical. It was just observed. A moment of pause. A quiet breath. The clocks resumed their rhythm the next day. But the moment was marked. So we wonder, Can a life of total consistency leave an imprint even in silence? Can the echo of a man's method remain not in invention, but in the gentle tick of something that never stopped? In the decades after Johann Alder's death, the world of timekeeping shifted dramatically. Swiss watchmakers began embracing industrialization. Precision gears were stamped by machines. Escapements became standardized. Factories in Geneva and Neuchâtel exported affordable pocket watches across Europe and beyond. Names like Breguet, Lecoultre, and Patek began to rise in renown. In this new age of innovation, the humble, unsigned clocks of Johann Alder slowly fell into obscurity, quietly ticking in corners, forgotten by most, yet still alive. No one spoke of Alder as a master craftsman. He was not mentioned in horological treatises or industry retrospectives. His techniques were never preserved in technical diagrams. No apprentices published memoirs. And yet his clocks remained. By 1850, over 500 of Alder's clocks were still in operation across the canton of Zurich. By 1900, more than 200 were still wound weekly by their owners, some of whom had inherited them from grandparents who had once known Johann in person. And today, in attics, farmhouse kitchens, and rural rectories across Switzerland, a handful still tick. These clocks are not museum pieces. They are not showpieces. They simply work. They chime the hour. They mark the passing of a moment. And in doing so, they preserve the method of a man who refused to change for 50 years. A clock in the wrong place. One such clock made its way, curiously, to a university office in Basel in the mid-20th century. It had no label, no ornate case, no markings beyond a serial number scratched faintly into the inside of the wooden door. 312. The philosophy professor who inherited the office asked the custodian about it. The reply: "Oh, that's an Alder, it's always been here." No one remembered where it came from. It was wound each Monday. It ticked softly. Once, a visiting scholar complained that the ticking was distracting. The professor replied, "It reminds me that the world doesn't care how clever we are, it just keeps going." This clock remains in the office to this day. And still, no one has had to repair it. Memory without name. Unlike the makers of the grand cathedral clocks or the jeweled timepieces of royalty, Alder left no epigrams, no philosophy of time. But perhaps he didn't need to. His philosophy was in his practice. Time was not a commodity. Accuracy was a matter of respect, not precision. A good tool was one that did the same thing well, every day. The best praise was for a job never noticed. In this way, Alder's life reflects a truth that rarely makes it into history books. That stability, when sustained over time, is a form of quiet greatness. We are taught to admire change, disruption, boldness. But what of the man who held still, who did not chase the future, but kept a steady rhythm while the world transformed around him? Johann Alder never improved his tools, and yet his clocks outlived him. He never sought fame, yet his work continued to serve. He changed nothing except perhaps the way time felt to those who trusted it to his hands. The silence that follows the chime. Today, few people remember Alder's name. But every hour in some quiet room, one of his clocks may still chime. A soft, metallic bell, a moment measured. And then the silence that follows. Not the silence of emptiness, but of trust. The trust that time will continue. Unchanged, unhurried. Ticking forward. Because someone once chose to do things the same way, every day, until it was right.